Let's say that we have a simple service, weather service, where we are saving a weather for specific city, and also we are getting that information from the database. Chances are that you are using a Spring for this application. But what is the problem with the Spring? Spring has several problems, one of which is that the data source, which means that whenever we start a Spring application, let's say we start 5 application, right, in 6 months, and for each of those applications, we need to set up the database connection, we need to set up the connection pools. Also for those, we need to set up the define every servlet, filter, and the mapping manually. We need to describe all our beans either in the XML configuration file, or we need to create separate Java config or annotation config. And also we need to manage the dependency. And also for the application servers, in order to deploy our application, we need to build a var and deploy to the Tomcat, GBoss, and the other servers. So besides that, what else we have, right? Also, 80%, statistically 80% of the enterprise applications use the same setup. So what I mean by that? What I mean is that every enterprise app that we are using, they are one or the other way need to connect to the database, right? So we need to configure the database connection. They are usually, we are using the REST API, so we need the Spring MVC for the REST API. Also for the persistent layer, we need to GPA, so we need to set up the Spring Data GPA. And also for the Spring security, we are using a Spring Security for the authentication and authorization and so on. So, and 80% of all applications, all the enterprise application, basically use the same dependencies, same tools in order to build the application. So to close that gap, Spring Boot was created. Spring Boot is basically opinionated Spring. So what's that mean is, instead of you manually configuring your beans, setting up the dependencies, managing the dependencies, and doing all the related work, Spring Boot already does it for you. So basically what you need to do is you just need to start your application with just running your application. You don't have to deploy that you don't need to build a var and deploy the Tomcat server, because it has already embedded Tomcat in it. So to define the advantages of the Spring Boot, right? So what's the first advantage? It's the auto configuration. So what it means is Spring Boot automatically configure app based on the dependencies you have added. So for example, let's say that you are building a web application, right? So most of the cases is that you are building a web application. In that case, so what you need to do, you need to have a Tomcat, you need to have a Spring MVC, so you need to have a JSON. Instead of adding all those dependencies manually, you can just add the Spring Boot Starter Web. So Spring Boot Starter Web, it contains all of those dependencies, and they are all of those dependencies compatible version of those dependencies. If you don't have it, then what you need to do is you need to go, for example, add the Tomcat dependency as Spring MVC dependency, and you need to verify that okay, all these versions are compatible. But in auto configuration, you can just add the Spring Boot Starter Web, which will do that for you. The next one is that the starter dependencies. As I said, so for everything that you do in the Spring Boot, we have a starter. Starter has, for example, we have a starter for the web, we have a starter for the data JPA layer. That is in the data JPA is basically, instead of adding that the JPA layer Hibernate and all other related dependencies, with the Spring Data JPA, you are adding all those dependencies at once. So it has also embedded server. So instead of deploying, as I mentioned earlier, instead of building var and deploying that to Tomcat server as we used to earlier, so what we are doing is we are just deploying so we are basically running our application with the run button. And also it has the actuator. It's a production ready features such as health check, metrics, and the monitoring. And it also has the Spring Boot CLI, basically, that we can use in order to quickly start our application. Again, it's a Spring Boot. To sum up, what is the Spring Boot, right? In one sentence, is basically opinionated Spring. So basically, Spring Boot is advanced version of the Spring, where instead of you defining all those dependencies manually, you are resolving all of those dependencies manually. You are just adding starters and start your application. It's not always the case. Sometimes those starters are over-engineering for your application. You need to use them carefully. For example, instead of adding that starter, you can add only the dependencies that in that library, but it should be considered case by case. So again, to sum up, Spring Boot is opinionated Spring, which helps you to quickly start up and develop your enterprise app.